Well, good morning and welcome to the Betsy and Walter Stern Conference Center here at Hudson Institute. I'm Ken Weinstein, President and CEO of Hudson. I'd like to offer a special welcome to the C-SPAN viewing audience and the good folks at C-SPAN for making today's event available to a national audience. Hudson Institute, as many of you know, is a future-oriented international policy research organization founded in 1961 by the late geostrategist and futurist Herman Kahn. Our analytic policy research seeks to promote security, prosperity, and freedom. We're very fortunate today to be hearing from Professor Bruce Owen of Stanford University, who will be speaking on an important and underanalyzed phenomena, especially here in Washington, the cost of political corruption in America. Professor Owen, who is a noted figure in both academia and public policy, will be introduced by my colleague, Senior Fellow Harold Furchtgott-Roth, who directs Hudson Institute's Center for the Economics of the Internet. The center's research and public programs make the case that market principles, clear property rights, contracts, and competition should apply to Internet policy as well. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce Harold, who is widely considered one of the more original and influential minds on telecom policy here in Washington. Harold, who did his undergraduate work in economics at MIT and his PhD at Stanford, was chief economist of the House Commerce Committee and played a critical role in drafting the 1996 Telecommunications Act. Moreover, he served with great distinction on the Federal Communications Commission as a commissioner from 1997 to 2001. Without any further ado, let me turn it over to Harold.
Ken, thank you very much for that gracious introduction. We are very pleased today at the Center for the Economics of the Internet to have a C-SPAN audience. We also are having a live Ustream feed, so if you have questions during today's session, you can submit those questions via Twitter to the handle @Hudson Institute. That's one word, Hudson Institute. When we think about the Internet, some of the important questions about the Internet going forward is the relationship between the government and the Internet. How close a relationship will there be? Will the government regulate the Internet? Will it tax the Internet? Will it monitor who is on the Internet? Will it monitor your privacy on the Internet? The question for a lot of these has to do with who will make these decisions. Will they be done by private individuals and private companies, or will they be done by the government? Today, we have Professor Bruce Owen, who will be speaking about one of my favorite topics, which is corruption. Now, as you think about our talk today about corruption, I hope you'll keep in mind these questions about the future of the Internet and what the relationship between government and the Internet will be. Our speaker today is Professor Bruce Owen of Stanford University. I could read his bio, but let me simply say that Bruce has worked in government here in Washington at the very highest levels of both the White House and the Department of Justice. He has worked in the private sector. He has founded his own firm, which he headed for many years. He has written extensively in economics and has thought a great deal about the topic today. And I think he has insights about this that will be helpful to a general audience and helpful to those who are thinking about the future of the Internet. On a personal note, I've known Professor Owen for probably longer than either he or I would care to admit, and he's a great personal friend. He's also a wonderful speaker, and we're very honored to have him here today at the Hudson Institute. With that, let me turn it over to Bruce Owen.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome, Harold. Thank you. I'm glad to be here. It's a pleasure to come back to Washington, even in the middle of the summer, even from Cape Cod, and to talk about corruption. I've subtly changed the topic or the title of the talk from the costs of corruption to market failures. That reflects the changes in my thinking over the last weeks as I've absorbed comments from people like you who have listened to my ravings and made suggestions. It's the same topic. There's been no change. I'm just looking at it from a variety of perspectives. This is a work in progress. I'm at work on a book about this subject, whatever it is, and I'll tell you about it in some detail, and I'll try and leave ample time at the end for questions or comments, which I would value. To a Washington audience, most of what I have to say should sound very familiar. I'm describing things that you all seen and experienced in terms of what goes on in Washington and how agencies and individual political figures make decisions and what influences them. I have relied to the extent possible on empirical evidence from the political science literature, which is nowadays increasingly quantitative. Political scientists in the academic world are becoming more and more like economists. I'm not sure that their elders like that very much, but it's no longer the accepted thing to write yet another biography of Abraham Lincoln in order to get tenure. Instead, you have to run regressions. So I've been reading some of those regressions. Here's a rough outline of my talk. I'm first going to describe what I take as given for purposes of the discussion to follow, just a few things. And then I'll talk about the various actors that go into the making of public policy and the incentives that guide those actions and decisions. And then I'll talk briefly about an economic diagnosis of the reasons why this process goes off the rails and produces bad outcomes. And I'll define what I mean by bad outcomes. And finally, I'll discuss some solutions, none of which are really obvious or easy, and one that you probably haven't heard of before. The essence of the argument as a whole is that policymakers, and I have here in mind chiefly members of Congress, have a biased set of incentives from the point of view of their duty to be faithful agents for their principles, where their principles are voted. So on big picture, high salience issues that everybody has a view about and cares about, they will follow what they perceive to be the interest of a majority of the people in their district or state. But on low salience issues, which are the vast majority of issues upon which they vote and take action, neither the voters nor they have any preconceived notion of what the right thing to do is, and they are rationally ignorant of those policy choices. And as a result, decision makers are free to serve their own interests, unhindered by voter discipline and unhindered by their own conscience. And their own interest has a lot to do with staying elected. Okay, it's perfectly obvious. Right? Who could argue with that? So on low salience issues, only the interest groups that can get together and effectively lobby Congress and policymakers in the administration or the agencies get their views represented. And groups, interest groups that aren't groups, don't participate, can't participate, aren't represented. Their views and their influence is missing from the debate, and they get shafted, to use a technical economic term. Okay, so that's the big picture. A general observation that I think most people would agree with, even out in the field, that is, outside Washington, is that regulatory, tax, procurement, and lots of other policies at the federal and state level that come out of legislative actions or administrative agency actions don't seem consistent with economic welfare maximization. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Or common notions of equity. So the Occupy Wall Street movement stands for the idea that the rich get richer because they have influence, they have friends in Washington. Okay? You may or may not agree, and it may or may not be a fact, but that's the common feeling. And by welfare, aggregate welfare, I simply mean the standard thing, which is the size of the pie. Does a given policy, a given law, a given regulation tend to increase the size of the pie or not? Okay, if it does, I'll call it welfare enhancing. And then the issue of how it gets divided is a distributional or equity question that people have very diverse views about. But one thing that most people might agree on is it would be good if we didn't make poor people worse off. I attribute that to John Rawls, a political philosopher of the last century, a very liberal political philosopher, but that insight, which incorporates supply-side economics and the effect of incentives on the size of the pie, is an important insight that I think many people who are not liberal, in the sense that I'm using the term, not 19th century liberal, but 20th century liberal, might agree with. So I've actually defined some of these things already. First, corruption. Larry Lessig, a Harvard law professor and former telecommunications wizard, wrote a book last year called Republic Lost, which is about political corruption in general. And in the course of writing this book, he defined two kinds of corruption, type 1 and type 2. It sounds pretty academic. So type 1 corruption is the kind everybody knows about. It's when somebody takes a bribe to do something he wouldn't otherwise have done, to do a favor. Okay? That is, of course, unlawful. And there isn't all that much of it in the U.S., at least at the federal level. It's more commonly found in some city governments, perhaps, maybe some states. But, you know, when a congressman gets caught with piles of cash in his freezer, that's big news. It's not something that we're commonly exposed to. And I think it's quite true. And Lessig emphasizes this, that most people in Congress are well-meaning, honest people who are trying to do the right thing. Okay? They're not crooks, as Richard Nixon said. Type 2 corruption is still corruption in the sense that a congressman is violating his or her responsibility to the voters by voting for things that don't increase the size of the pie, either nationally or in the district, however you want to think about it. Perhaps not on purpose for that reason, but in order to do something else, in order to do a political favor for somebody. A political favor that does not violate the congressman's or senator's principles, because the senator or congressman has no principle applicable to the issue. The issue is usually technical, relatively minor. It's not in the newspapers. You know, should the FCC repeal the financial interest in syndication rule? Who knows? Right? Tell me how I should vote. Well, there are lobbyists who will tell, and those same lobbyists represent people who support politicians who vote the right way on things. So, is it unlawful? Should it be unlawful? It would be impossible to make it unlawful, because you'd never be able to bring a case. How do you prove a congressman voted differently than he or she would have voted in the absence of a political contribution? And in general, they literally don't do anything that would violate their conscience because of the absence of a view. So policy issues, the things about which people in Congress make decisions to vote or to take a legislative action, procedural action of some kind, and the things that agencies decide to do or not to do are ranked according to political salience. I can rank them any way I want to. Either they make the news or they don't. The things that make the news and people care about and attract audiences, and I'm talking about mass audiences, 24-hour-a-day news channels and the like, are things that people care about and get excited about. And there's only a few of those things relative to all the policy issues that exist and go on. And the low salience issues are at the other end of that spectrum. Obviously, there's a spectrum and there's things in the middle. The test for me of whether a policy or an action is a good thing or a bad thing, I've already suggested, is economic welfare. Does it make the pie bigger or smaller? And equity. Does it violate some given notion of equity, such as, for example, Rawls's suggestion that we should at least not make poor people worse off? There's also something else we'll take as given, and this is relevant chiefly to the issue of solutions to this problem that I will describe, and that is the First Amendment. This is the context here is Citizens United. I assume you've all heard of a Supreme Court decision dealing with whether or not it's constitutional for Congress to regulate donations by private individuals to campaigns, either directly or by supporting independently the election of a particular candidate. The First Amendment contains lots of things, but one of them is the right to petition Congress for redress of grievances, and the other is freedom to speak, freedom of speech and of the press. Religion is in there too, but the Supreme Court said it might be true that political corruption happens because people make campaign contributions. We don't believe it's true. In fact, the court seemed to say, as a matter of fact, that it isn't true, which is odd. But in any event, they said, even if it were true, the First Amendment trumps concern with corruption. So people can make contributions because it's a constitutional right. I agree with that. I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing for the Supreme Court to have decided, but it has consequences. Okay, and one of them is that political contributions are likely to be made by people with money and who are well organized and who want to support political actors who have been friendly. Obviously, you want to keep your friends in office. It's not necessarily quid pro quo, right? A congressman may have strong personal views about something, may vote those views, and what's wrong with those people who benefit from or simply agree with those views donating money to that congressman's campaign? Hard to say that anything is wrong with it. So anyway, the First Amendment is a constraint on what can be done. Like all economists, when I talk about a model, which I'll describe in words and not mathematically, I'm keeping other things equal. There's 1,000 things that affect political outcomes in Washington and elsewhere, and I'm only going to talk about a few of them. And that means I'm holding other things constant. I guess I was around Nino too much. I used the Latin version of that. First, political representatives in general are not required to have their own views on low salience issues. They don't need to have them, and there's no reason why they should have them, or even could have them, on all the issues that come up for action in Congress. Okay, so conscience is not a constraint for a huge range of policy decisions. Furthermore, congressional representatives are not responsible to voters on low salient issues because voters don't know or care about those issues. This means that the incentive set up by a competitive election system, which is what we have, right? We have a democratic republic. We don't use direct democracy. We use representatives to sort of insulate decision-making from the passions of the masses. That was Madison's idea. There's a disconnect between the views of the voters or the interest of the voters and their representative when it comes to low salient issues. If you violate the voters' preferences on high salient issues, you take a chance on not getting elected or reelected. You can, with impunity, vote any way you like on low salient issues because the voters don't care, don't know or care. What is your own interest if you're a political actor? Presumably staying in office. Must be some reason why you wanted to get there. Power, chance to do good, further political ambitions. Those things all rely on staying in office, advancing in seniority. How do you do that? Well, you avoid competitive elections by attracting faithful followers, by doing things that attract votes and money. Even if you're a safe incumbent in a safe district, there's always a chance of a challenger. And having a war chest of campaign funds available to spend is an important deterrent to facing a serious challenge if you're an incumbent. So everybody in office needs money, even incumbents with seniority. And every once in a while we hear about a senior incumbent who gets kicked out in a primary by somebody else with money. It does happen. Here's a point where Harold and I disagree. Harold, based on his personal experience, which is considerable, and I, based on my reading of the empirical political science literature. The literature, as I read it, says that by and large, agencies, not just the independent agencies, so-called, like the FCC, but also executive branch agencies, like the Bureau of Indian Affairs, are largely beholden to congressional committees and more likely to be responsive to the wishes of those committees and their committee leaders than to the president or the president's agents. And especially budget control gives the people who run those agencies a strong incentive to be responsive to the wishes of Congress and the relevant committees that they face. And the same influences that affect congressional votes also affect agency decisions. The same lobbyists, or at least the same organizations and interests, lobby agencies just as they lobby Congress, and often serves as a means of communication between the two. So policymaking in Washington involves a lot of communicating back and forth between committee staffs, agency heads, committee chairs, the press, where relevant, trade press, and so on. And on most issues, the vast majority of issues that actually get decided, the president, the White House plays little or no role. The president doesn't have the resources to ride herd on all of that. And the mechanism doesn't give him much incentive to get involved. The courts, which might be troubled by the fact that the process of interest group representation, both at Congress and in administrative procedure, is biased against certain hard to represent interests, ignore that. The courts a long time ago, during the Depression era and even before, ceded power to Congress to delegate decision-making authority to the bureaucracy. So Congress took over administration responsibilities that might have been undertaken by the president and delegated those duties to agencies. The delegation doctrine is usually characterized by referring to Humphrey's executor, which sounds like something out of Bleak House, but essentially the Supreme Court decision that gave Congress the right to delegate its powers to make law and some adjudicatory powers to individual agencies, and not just the independent agencies. What the courts have jealously guarded is their right to decide whether the people involved got due process. So there's an elaborate set of administrative procedures that provide for due process. The courts review cases, review policy decisions by the agencies, and of course by Congress for due process and for consistency with the Constitution. The due process, the elements of due process are whatever the courts say they are, and missing from that list of rights in due process is any consideration of whether there is actual effective representation of poorly organized interests. That necessarily means that to the extent the process is affected by interest representation, and if it isn't, what are we worried about? Why have any worries about administrative process or access to administrative process? Why have this elaborate hearing and notice requirement in administrative agencies, for example, or legislation in the Sunshine Laws? The media largely arbitrate this decision about what's low salience and what's high salience. The studies of voter behavior that are now proliferating in the behavioral economics literature, social psychology literature, neuroeconomics literature suggest that voters are interested chiefly and make decisions with respect to media consumption chiefly on the basis of what they call affective rather than cognitive criteria. So again, I'm not telling anybody anything you don't already know. Emotion plays a big role in decision making, all kinds of decision making, not least voting, and not least the choice of entertainment. And news is a kind of entertainment. So media compete for audiences. A mechanism for competition is the emotional content and attractiveness of the content, which is why the local news is full of shootings and fires, because that attracts people's attention, even though it may not be the most important thing affecting their lives. There's a whole literature called collective action theory. Vancer Olson was the modern originator of this body of theory. It simply says that interest groups that are easily organized will typically be small in number, not groups, but the individuals comprising them. It's easy to organize a small group, hard to organize a large group. Why? Because in a large group, every individual member will think he or she can free ride on everybody else. So there's less incentive to join. If you are one of a small group, much of the benefit of your action or activity or donations will benefit you. And so you have a greater incentive to take part and to organize. And there are other criteria. So small groups, industry groups, for example, professional groups tend to be more easily organized than groups with diffuse interest in large numbers. So here's some examples of groups that are very hard to organize effectively for political action. Consumers. okay, notwithstanding the existence of so-called consumer advocates who have no direct link or responsibility to consumers. Small investors, entrepreneurs who are trying to start a business. Once they've started a business successfully, they get to be on the inside. But until they've gotten inside, they are potentially victimized by people who are already inside. Non-union workers, except to the extent that employers who like to hire non-union workers can represent their interests. Okay, so you just think about the criteria. A non-obvious criteria for a successful interest group is passionate interest. Think about all the people who care about the environment and some of the things they're willing to do, right? They're willing to separate their garbage even though they can see the garbage man throwing it all into the same pile. Okay, so why would they still keep doing that? Well, because they care passionately. They're irrational. Their decision to do something for the environment is driven by an emotional impulse to do good. They care about the environment, and an environmental or other passionate interest is capable of being organized nationally, even though there's a diffuse interest in a free rider problem and so on. So environmental groups are politically powerful in spite of the fact that you wouldn't predict that any more than you'd predict that consumers or consumer interests would be successfully organized. Perhaps the biggest, I think, factor here, aside from ordinary incentives that people face, voters, politicians, agencies, is the administrative state. Beginning with the populist era more than a century ago, late 19th century, and growing throughout the 20th century, is an entirely new kind of government that would have been completely foreign to the framers of our Constitution. And it's called the regulatory state or the administrative state. And it's the extent to which Congress, Washington, controls economic activity throughout the entire country, throughout the entire economy. There aren't very many places left that aren't controlled by Washington, either directly through direct regulation, as in telecommunications, or indirectly through generic regulations or so-called social regulations, such as environmental, occupational, health and safety, and related tax policy. That means that Congress is in a position it was not in 100 years ago to do favors or bad things to individual industries and groups. And that gives every economic actor in the economy an incentive to influence policy that they did not have 100 years ago. So the role of type 2 corruption, while it no doubt existed in some form from the beginning, in the administrative state assumes huge proportions. Every single economic actor has an incentive, which may or may not be realized because of collective action problems, to influence economic policy at the federal, and to a lesser extent the state, because the federal controls the state, level. So worse than that, political actors now realize that this is a way to enhance their own economic interest in staying in office, right? How do you increase the demand for political policy influence? A demand that is supplied by politicians in return for campaign contributions and other support. Well, you expand the administrative state. You give in to demands for new regulations because you know that when it comes to actually deciding what those regulations should be, there will be at least two sides, each willing to pay get their way. It's becoming increasingly common, I'm told, I don't vouch for this as a fact, but it sounds like it ought to be true, for legislation to be renewable. Regulatory reform used to propose, advocates of regulatory reform used to propose that we should have sunset rules on all regulations. So it would automatically expire after X years. That would give us a chance to review the regulations and make sure they were still appropriate. And increasingly that's happening. So, for example, right now there's a debate going on about renewal of certain aspects of proprietary drug regulation, the licensing of new drugs, the review process, and so on. That's pursuant to regulation that self-destructs every 3 or 4 years. So what happens when these things come up for renewal? Well, there's a big fight between the various interest groups, organized, effective interest groups, to affect the outcome of the renewal, to change the policy. And since something has to happen, since otherwise the whole thing goes away, the result is an opportunity to support or to gain support for political careers. So this mechanism attracts increased demand for the services of members of Congress. I've already mentioned the president and his general lack of interest or ability to oversee this process. Obviously, there are exceptions. For example, recent presidents have taken much more interest, or recent White Houses have taken much more interest in communications policy than had been true 50 years ago. So one way to think about all this, okay, this bad outcome that tends to shrink the pie and possibly to make the pie less justly distributed, since nobody cares about that objective. By nobody, I mean neither the voters nor the policymakers in Congress. It may be that we rely too much on competition as a paradigm. Okay, think about it, right? Everybody who's an economist thinks markets are great. But we all know that markets are great only in certain rather narrow circumstances where there aren't market imperfections. The whole business of studying economic regulation has to do with finding ways to fix markets so that they will operate more efficiently. You know, there may be an externality problem like pollution. It's best solved usually with a property right solution, or sometimes with a tax or a subsidy. There aren't very many perfect markets. There's always an issue about compared to what, right? The objection that market-oriented economists have to government regulation or government provision of services is not that the government couldn't do it better, but that in practice the government doesn't do it better. Okay, so even an imperfect market may be better than an even more imperfect government. But in any event, that's a debate you can have about any particular market and how it should be organized and possibly regulated. But still, competition is regarded as the correct default option for a market. And we owe that to Adam Smith. And we may even owe it to some of our genetic heritage. Because think about how much broader the attractiveness of competition goes, right? Think how often we resort to competition between nations in the form of wars. Think how much we like sports, which are about competition. Think how we elevate people who are good athletes, successful athletes, into moral icons, as judged by the horror that ensues when we discover they aren't. Poor Tiger Woods. He never claimed to be anything but a good golfer, right? Why were we outraged when we found out he was an ordinary human being? Perhaps worse than average, who knows, right? or the most recent victim of this phenomenon, was the biker. Yeah. So John Milton said, I actually brought it with me, I think. No, I didn't. John Milton said something like this: "Let all the winds of doctrine play upon the earth. Who can doubt but that truth will win in a fair and open competition?" Is that right? Is it really true that truth will come out in free debate and win? Well, maybe in the long run, but it could be a long time. Every day the newspaper is full of surprising things that we thought were false have turned out to be true, or vice versa. I mean, there's no empirical evidence that I'm aware of for the proposition that truth wins in the competition of ideas, the marketplace of ideas. There was a time in the development of British church law, ecclesiastical courts, when it was regarded as appropriate in certain circumstances for disputants, litigants, to fight with swords. And the guy who won must be right. He won the case. Later, that evolved into a system where the litigants hired champions, professional fighters. Each side hired one, and whoever won, that side won the litigation. Right? The theory was that God would ensure a just outcome. So that evolved later into the modern notion of, in British common law, that an adversarial process was the best way to find the truth. So as champions, we don't hire guys with swords. Instead, we hire lawyers, and they battle it out, and whoever wins, well, that must be the truth. What makes us think that? I mean, the stuff of television drama with courtrooms is full of instances, for what that's worth, where the good guys don't win for one reason or another. Why is combat the right way to solve a question of justice or a matter of fact? I must say the common law tradition is much more dependent on this than the administrative law or civil law tradition that's more used in Europe. Madison put competition into the Constitution. Competing candidates. The guy who won must be the best guy. Competing branches of government. Let them go fight. That way they won't have time to bother us. We have interest groups competing for rents, which is what I've been talking about here. If you think that interest group competition for benefits, rents, is a good thing, and remember, it's always compared to what? Then you might think that it's sort of a market failure that there's important interest groups like consumers that don't get represented in this process. And you might think that if we could find a way to represent their interests, the outcome would be better. But we have no model of that. We have no reason to think that's actually true, that interest group competition, as opposed to markets where farmers grow wheat, is going to produce an efficient outcome. Maybe. It'd be interesting to build a model of it, but we don't have one. There is no invisible hand theorem for markets other than markets dominated by profit-seeking firms and utility-maximizing consumer. Okay? We have no right to assume that interest group competition is the right way to do it, or that fixing the bias that exists that I've been talking about in interest group competition in Washington will necessarily produce welfare increases or greater equity. It just seems fairer. That's all. That's all you can say about it. And fair is pretty loosely defined. Still, compared to what? So here's some solutions. These are solutions that, except for the last one, have all been proposed in one form or another for dealing with the problem of excessive interest group influence on the policy-making process. Okay? Citizens United continued a long battle for campaign finance reform. Okay, it now seems clear that if there's going to be campaign finance reform, it's going to have to come in the form of a constitutional amendment of some kind. Larry Lessig actually proposes a constitutional convention, which would not be limited to campaign reform. That's the most dangerous idea I've heard in a long time. Those guys who got together the last time we had a constitutional convention, they got together in Philadelphia in 1787 or 8 and put together a constitution. They went off the rails. They were asked to make a few modest changes in the Articles of Confederation. They threw the whole thing out and started from scratch. Now, it had what is apparently a very good result, right? This thing has survived with a lot of both explicit and implicit changes over the years, but still, I mean, that could have been a terrible disaster. Maybe the fact that, there were people like George Washington and Ben Franklin and James Madison and Thomas Jefferson by mail, and George Mason and other folks like that present was some basis for thinking that the result would be good. Who would the state legislatures send to a national constitutional convention today? Would it be people of that caliber? It just doesn't bear thinking about. So in any event, campaign finance reform is not an appropriate answer to the underlying problem here. The problem is not that we give money to politicians to support campaigns. The problem is the absence of effective representation of economically important interest groups. Campaign reform does nothing to affect that. Even if the government supported all campaigns with government money, found some way to open up primaries and so on, still, we would have lobbyists because of the First Amendment, and the lobbyists would have important power because they are very effective and persuasive people, and they hire staff from Congress, right? And they hire congressmen. And a lot of what happens in Washington on non-salient issues has to do with favors and friendship because nobody cares about the actual issue. There's a concept called the unitary executive, which is pushed actually by Elena Kagan, now on the Supreme Court. She wrote a law review article in the Harvard Law Review about 30 years ago, in which she suggested that it would be interesting to consider simply having the president assert control over the bureaucracy. In effect, use a kind of coup, right? A constitutional coup, not violent, not using force, but the president simply starts issuing orders to the bureaucracy, including agencies like the FTC and the FTC, and becomes, as a result, responsible for the size of the pie as it's affected by the agency, and usurps Congress's present prerogative to control those decisions. Because the president is subject to election and re-election, the process might work better in terms of consumer interest. That's the argument. Not just consumer, but ill-represented interest in general. The drug czar and other czars that we've had for one purpose or another are examples of the president exercising this kind of initiative. Many agencies were responsible for drug enforcement. The president uses the bully pulpit and sort of adjacency to the president's office to exercise moral suasion in the form of a White House official who's very prominent and newsworthy and makes policy speeches, and the bureaucracy is supposed to get behind them because they're afraid to do anything else. It's a pretty loosey-goosey kind of way to direct policy, and it's clearly only going to work on a few salient issues. It's not something the president could effectively do on a broad scale and affect all the hundreds and thousands of non-salient policy decisions that get made in the bureaucracy. Now that we have the internet, we could have direct democracy. I mean, one of the objections to direct democracy at the time of the Constitutional Convention in 1787 and 8 was, how could you possibly get people together outside of a New England town meeting context? There's too many people, distances are too long. How could you get together and debate and decide and vote on every policy, right? This is long before the administrative state was even an issue, right? Clearly it can't be done today, and voters are not reliable on low salience issues. Voters are rationally ignorant of those issues, and they are irrationally passionate about issues that they care about, and in neither case can their decisions be trusted. It's not all that different from Madison's view of insulating the republic from the passions of the masses. We can empower citizens. This is a similar idea, and it's very popular right now. We can get lots of information and analysis directly to citizens. Again, an internet-related idea. Right? In a way, that's what C-SPAN is all about. Right? Brian Lamb, a long time ago, saw that if people could actually see Congress in action or inaction, they might take greater interest and be better informed and more intelligent voters. With the internet, we can go much further than that. In addition to what actually happens in real life, live in Congress, we can actually access all the documents. There isn't anyone alive who has the ability to actually do that, right? You devote your whole life to it and get only to a very tiny fraction of it. There is no voter, however smart, however educated, who can vote intelligently on a large fraction even of all the issues that come up for policy decisions in a given month or year. Seems that empowering citizens probably is not a feasible alternative. How about insulating regulators? Insulating regulators from outside influence. Well, that's what administrative procedure is all about, right? Administrative procedure is supposed to sweep clean the air of the back room where the political decisions and policy decisions are made. It has not succeeded in the sense that it has not succeeded in achieving effective interest group participation by all of the affected interests. Repealing Humphrey's executor is sort of the other side of the coin of a unitary executive. It would force Congress itself to make all these decisions rather than delegate them to the bureaucracy. How would Congress do that? Right? I guess they would expand the staff. Hard to imagine. Well, I guess it's worth thinking about. I mean, it's conceivable that it might lead to the next bullet point, which is, how about rolling back the administrative state? To the extent that the administrative state exists at its present size and extent, partly because of incentives to make political gains at the expense of the size of the pie, then it would be a good thing to roll it back. It's clear that's not going to happen, but it's worth thinking about. The courts could use, instead of due process, what I've somewhat sarcastically called intelligent due process, by which I mean in reviewing agency decisions, trying to figure out whether the appropriate interests were in fact effectively represented in the process, as opposed to merely having theoretical access to the process. Okay, if the courts turn down decisions that shrink the size of the pie or decrease equity, and it's because of type 2 corruption, why not strike down those policies and send them back to the agency and let the agency figure out how to get the unrepresented interests into the debate somehow? And last, and I'll end on this truly quixotic suggestion. Before there was a Roman Empire, there was a Roman Republic. And it lasted, much of this is probably mythical, but it lasted, it is said, for around 500 years, right? It was founded 535 BC, according to Livy. And the history of the Roman Republic is known largely through legend. It wasn't written down until quite late in the game. But one of the things in the more or less mythical history of the Roman Republic was that they kicked out the kings and established a representative republic. Of course, the only people who were represented were rich people who were generals or warriors, or warrior class, the equestrian class. They made up the Senate. The Senate voted on all policies. They represented about 1% of the population. Everybody else was called a plebe, or plebeian, commoners. Of course, there were subgroups within the plebeians, farmers versus the tradesmen, and so on. But the plebeians kept getting oppressed by the equestrian Senate. And as a result, they would, from time to time, revolt. So the myth goes that around 480 BC, in one of those revolts, the plebs got up and physically moved off to another hill and left the equestrians in their Senate alone, with nobody to grow food or provide goods and services or cook meals or whatever it was that the equestrians needed to survive. And so the equestrians were forced to negotiate with the plebeians, some sort of constitutional compromise. And at least the initial solution was the creation of an office called the Tribune. There were at first 2, and later in the Republic there were 10. A tribune was elected by the plebeians. It's an elected office. It is said to have lasted only a year. You were only in office for a year. And during that year, either tribune could veto any act of the Senate. And anyone who harmed a tribune, physically harmed a tribune, was cursed by the gods and could be lawfully killed by any citizen. So, does this hold any lessons for us? Well, I suppose it might. You could imagine an office, perhaps an elective office, in the United States, which you might call a tribunate, headed by a person or a group of persons whose responsibility is to review both legislation and administrative decisions and to veto, with a line item veto, those that either reduce welfare or make poor people worse off, and send the legislation or policy back to whatever body enacted it to try again. Now, if you want to take this seriously, it almost certainly would require a constitutional amendment, which gets into all the difficulties of constitutional amendments. And of course, Congress is not going to enact such a remedy on its own. But what it does do is draw attention to the underlying problem, which is how a institutional change in our system of government could cope with the incentive problem that threatens to reduce the size of the pie and perhaps its distribution over the long run in a way which is inimical to our competitive position in the world. And to the extent that continues, and our competitive position in the world continues to shrink in relative terms, the political and economic pressures to do something will no doubt increase. It would be nice to fix the problem sooner rather than later. Thank you. I'll be glad to answer questions if anybody's got the patience.
Why don't we start up here? If people could please identify yourself, and so that we can get in as many questions as possible, please keep your questions to probably 30 seconds or less. Thank you very much.
Milton Grenfell, citizen. It was a good overview, but it seems you missed something that I regard as fundamental, and so would Aristotle. It's a question of scale. There's a proper scale for all organisms, including states. When George Washington only rose once to speak on the Constitutional Convention floor, it was about the question of representation. Should it be 40,000 per congressman or 30? He stood and said it should be 30. We now represent, a congressman represents, I think, 700,000 people? The problem is scale. We need to break the country into smaller portions, would be my suggestion. What do you think of that?
I don't know what I think of it because I've never heard the issue raised before. I guess my first response would be, doesn't technology change things? Getting together in a meeting with your constituents is an awfully good thing. It conjures up the town meeting concept. But to the extent communication is cheaper and easier than it used to be, perhaps that should affect what we think of as the optimal scale. The other is, how does this affect the incentives of people to participate in political debate? Does it do anything to make it more likely that diffuse large numbers groups will have a greater voice than they did or they do now? I don't know the answer to either question, but those are the things that come to mind.
Lady over here, second row.
The press has carried stories on the president's use of executive power, legally or not so legally, in overturning or revising administrative orders and even provisions of law. Would you have a comment on this practice, where it may be headed? Period.
Yeah, you do hear about that. You do hear about the president exercising or asserting powers on high salient issues where his moral authority in a gray area of law, or an area of law that, as the courts would say, is a political matter rather than a matter of black letter law. My point is not that that doesn't happen or can't happen, but that it must happen rarely, because the president doesn't have the resources to exercise that kind of power across the board with respect to the many, many, many issues that I'm referring to. All the work of all the agencies that constitute the making of law.
Bruce, isn't this Justice Kagan's point about the unitary executive almost?
Exactly. Justice Kagan's point is that if the president felt responsible to the electorate for the work of the bureaucracies, because it was understood that they were doing what he wanted, which is not the way things are now, to the extent anybody has an understanding, then the process might work better.
Here in the front.
Professor Owen, Tim Kaine, Chief Economist here at Hudson. Loved your presentation. When you asked what the alternative was, it seemed ironic to me as an economist that what I've analyzed as the problem is that we have a monopoly, or actually a duopoly of power. And democracy itself was the alternative to what had existed for, thousands of years, which was dictatorship. And the problem you identified of interest groups, the type 2 corruption, that happened with kings, right? So you had higher tariffs, you had guilds with more power than consumers then. We'd maybe diminish that with democracy, maybe direct democracy would go further. But I wanted to ask a question about Citizens United, because that seemed to break up this power of monopoly, which an economist would say was, the problem with the king or a dictator, and we have a political system where it's duopoly, you want that dispersed. So you want independent groups to have their own voices, large consumer unions, trade groups that before had to get funneled through the Republicans and Democrats. So would you agree that maybe that's a good breakup of power?
It certainly has the potential to contribute to that. The issue is what has changed in terms of the incentives facing members of the kinds of groups that I'm concerned about. Consumers is a typical example. What's going to make them participate in the governance of the people who are representing them or purport to represent them? I mean, we already have public interest groups, so-called, or consumer interest groups. They're funded by donations. I suppose they must do at least some political contributions already. I worry that their governance process seems often to produce policy recommendations that are at odds with my sense of what would be good for consumers. And I think that's because the consumer interests they represent don't in fact control the actions of the board. The spokespersons, the governing boards, are the donors, and they have whatever interest they have, but they aren't typically the interest of consumers. And they don't seem well informed from an economic point of view about what those interests might be.
On this side here.
Yes, sir. My name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is about, you mentioned about something, a Roman Republic. Is that older or Hindu religion is older? I'm asking this because you said that in Roman Republic, there were 1% people who are considered rich or elite. That very concept is a part of Hindu religion, as you know. Brahman are the only people who are supposed to rule. And then Hindu religion believe that some people are genetically more intellectual like Brahman, and some people are genetically better fighter. And then you have outcast, the lowest one. And I asked the same question to Charles Murray because, as you know, his book, Bell Curve, kind of perpetuate this notion. But he disagreed, but I asked him very charged question that Hindu religion seemed to be more authentic than monotheistic religion, because Hindu religion, follower of Hindu religion never conquered anything. They are very peaceful. Contrary to Hindu religion, these monotheistic religion always talk about peace, but all they do kill each other. By the way, I'm not Hindu, I'm a Muslim. Thanks.
I'm not sure quite where to begin with this. Obviously, individuals are born with different abilities, and their environment also affects the realization of those potentials. But we're pretty much stuck with the notion that everybody ought to get one vote in spite of that, and that a democracy is, while obviously subject to lots of imperfections, the best available means for ensuring freedom. And that's because I guess it has the potential to facilitate revolt in the least bloody way. And beyond that, I really don't know what to say. There's all kinds of possibilities here.
Just following up on that question, so if the notion of a tribune is, so who in your judgment would be should be having the veto power? Is this something that would be in a Jacksonian democracy, just your random from Tennessee? And I can say that having been born in Tennessee, but or is this someone that the government itself would pick? Is this a democratic tribune, or is it sort of an elitist?
I'm afraid I've always thought of it as an economist. Seriously, George Shultz would be a great tribune. A person who is realistic about what's possible, who operates in the real world, but nevertheless understands what's good for the people as a whole from an economic point of view, and doesn't sacrifice that needlessly in pursuit of some objective that's essentially deontological.
Question there, and then a question over here.
I'm Victor Stone, and I guess I have some trouble with your categorizing so many of the processes we use now as combative. The typical explanation of the legal system is not that it's combat today, but that the great engine of its truth is in the cross-examination process. Similarly, when we determine what theater plays or TV programs are likely to succeed, it's the critics in the public press who stick up for something or don't. Typically, when we come up to an election season, the debates are what people view as crucial. And it seems to me that all of those are examples of the what we think is a big mistake that was in the Soviet republics, which was that they didn't have transparency, that they didn't have a government in the sun, that there was no open society. And it seems to me that what I think we attempt to do here is not to have, well, we have a Tribune, but it's more like the Herald Tribune. People get to write op-ed columns, and Mr. Schultz, as well as others, are certainly sought-after critics to expose the issues that you think are not so momentous to the proper criticism they should get, which leaves me with the feeling that if we have that, your main complaint is, as you just said, you think we're stuck with one person, one vote. I guess I fear that the opposite of that is what Stalin wanted to do. He knew best, and he was going to impose it on a very large group of people, but his vision turned out to be rather imperfect. And since we don't have an ultimate truth about what's best, I mean, you seem to think that don't shrink the pie is the truth, but maybe given our current economy, just it may be in some circumstances, it may be that shrinking of the pie is better for a long run approach. I guess I see your suggestions as very non-democratic and only taking us back to the path of Stalin-type dictators.
Wow.
Wow.
I think it's really important to consider what the alternative is, and I mean that quite seriously. Relying on individual voters like me, who are driven to a substantial and even worse, unknown extent by emotional impulses rather than by rational calculation in all matters, not least voting, doesn't mean that voting, democratic voting, isn't the best available alternative. I would not do away with democratic voting. I think the system we have is an excellent one in many, many respects. It has this one flaw that I've identified, perhaps because at the time of the contention in 1788, the notion of an administrative state was not on the table, and there was no need to guard against it or the things that might flow from it. But in any event, I would hope that we could, within the context of our current system, make a correction for this market failure in the representation of important interest in decision-making. And I certainly wouldn't substitute a dictatorial system of any kind for the system that we have now. Giving a branch of government a veto is something we already have. The president can veto legislation. The Supreme Court can, in effect, veto legislation. I'm suggesting that a person concerned with aggregate economic welfare and equity might well have a useful right to veto legislation, subject, of course, to Supreme Court review and supermajority override.
We have one more question over here.
My name is Adam Garfinkel. I'm editor of the American Interest. I want to thank you for a very stimulating and very interesting talk. I learned a lot. I've got at least 15 questions I'd love to ask you, but I realize that I have to just choose one. So let me choose this one. In American history, there have been several waves, you might say, of what some people have called plutocracy. People with a lot of money sort of elbowing their way into political influence, and then there have been reactions against that have pushed things back the other way. Sometimes they've involved wars, depressions, whatever, but we've had a kind of an ebb and flow throughout American history. Some people say that now we are looking at yet another emanation of plutocracy, all the money washing around this town, all the lobbyists and so forth. And the question is there going to be another rising up of some sort, passionate emotion of some sort, perhaps led or guided by the executive branch to do what the progressives did in the past, to do what New Dealers did in the past, and so on. But it's always set up as, this thing is always set up as democracy, more democracy is the cure or the antidote for plutocracy or excessive corporate power involving itself in tilting the political playing field in a way that it's not level. But there was a guy many years ago at Yale named William Graham Sumner, who of whom I'm sure you know, who had a very interesting and counterintuitive theory about this. His theory was that, in fact, no, democracy was not an antidote to plutocracy, but that the wider the franchise and the more diffuse the interests in a democracy, the easier it would be for the logic of collective action to torque political judgments in favor of those who were already wealthy. And I'm wondering, in your schema here, how you read the relationship between plutocracy and democracy.
I think your characterization is right, and I think Madison was wrong when he proposed a stronger federal government as a cure for excessive power in the hands of passionate interest, because there would be more diffusion with a greater number of states and interests. It was a good idea for other reasons, but not for curing that problem. It is a problem, and I think that the most one can hope for that's within the scope of government policy is to view with great suspicion barriers to entry that create new successive plutocracy. Because plutocracies typically arise from not so much from inherited wealth as from new wealth. And new wealth is the result of new technology and innovation, business success in a new field, shifts in demand that are responded to, and the harder we make it for technology and entrepreneurs to do that, the less challenge there will be to the existing plutocracy that influences current policy. Of course, the existing plutocracy wants exactly the opposite result. Right? So I think a major thing to look for when worrying about whether the pie is going to grow or shrink is barriers to entry that keep out new suppliers of services that will reward the risk-taking entrepreneur.
And with that, let's thank Professor Owen for his comments. Thank you very much. I do particularly want to return to the notion that as we think about the future of the internet and internet governance and internet regulation and internet taxation and all of the different roles of government in the internet, a lot of these decisions have not been made yet, and I think that Professor Owen's talk has certainly raised doubts about how well government might do with some of these issues. A couple of notes for the future. Mid-September, there will be a conference here organized by Hans Kuntner on broadband in rural America. On October 18th, Commissioner Olhausen of the Federal Trade Commission will be speaking about privacy, and I'm sure you won't want to miss that. So with that, thank you very much for coming to this session, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.